Do we have too much government?
We need to put people ahead of corporate profits.
This system is so lopsided. This threat is a real threat to democracy.
And I think that's really important. That's something we haven't been doing in this country for a long time.
Where do you start? What do you do? How do you do it?
Access to Democracy and other Eagan community television programming is supported by Thomson Reuters, makers of Westlawn Next and based in Eagan. Through Westlawn Next and other innovative online services, Thomson Reuters is the world's leading source of intelligent information for businesses and professionals. Online at thomsonreuters.com. And by U.S. Federal Credit Union, the member-owned financial institution offering service, value, and experience you can trust to the greater Twin Cities community.
Access to Democracy returns, Alan Miller returns, and Zack Sullivan, Professor Zack Sullivan, or Dr. Zack Sullivan returns. And we're going to talk a little politics today. Zack is a professor at Inver Hills, and he's been there for, 6 years now?
That's right.
Was taught at some other places. He's been involved in a lot of issues. And I want to ask you to start. What happened to the Tea Party this week?
Right.
There were Republican primaries all over the country. The Tea Party challenged the establishment Republicans, who I'm not happy with anyway, but certainly more happy than I am with the Tea Party. It's just a personal note. And the Tea Party seemed to get slammed every place.
Yeah, it seemed that way. And thanks for having me on the show again, Alan. I appreciate it. It's always great to talk to you. Well, I think there's a few things that went on there. One is that, first of all, the Republican Party has adopted a lot of the Tea Party platforms. So this still isn't the Republican Party of Reagan, and certainly not the Republican Party of Nixon or Ford. So I think you have an interesting thing. There's greater pragmatism within the Republican Party. I think you're seeing that. They want to win elections. But also you're seeing a lot of the issues just simply being adopted by the Republican Party, and therefore it doesn't leave as much room for the Tea Party to move, or when those issues are being validated by mainstream Republicans in a lot of senses.
I.e. Mitch McConnell would be a perfect example.
Right, yeah. I think you saw that going on in Kentucky, where Mitch McConnell was not placing himself necessarily as a moderate. He, in a sense, sort of, his
approval rating is way down, and yet he clobbered his opposition.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think it's a very interesting thing, and I think what you saw with Mitch McConnell was that he absorbed a lot of Tea Party issues. These weren't mainstream. He wasn't running as a moderate. He ran, it's an amusing thing, but he ran an outsider campaign in Kentucky, talking about how somebody needed to go to Washington and deal with the establishment. He was just the man to do it. Of course, he is the ultimate establishment figure. So
it'll be 36 years in the Senate for him.
Absolutely. So I think they recognize that even if they don't necessarily always govern that way, that the right way to run in primaries is as a someone who wants to take on the establishment.
Let's say radical.
I think that might be a good way to put it. So I think that's what's sort of taking the wind out of the sails of the Tea Party movement. It's just this adoption of the issues. Now, as to whether or not the Republican Party really wants to seek policy change in those areas. But I also think these Tea Party strategies, shutting down the government, they turned out to be huge political failures. So that also made it easier for folks like McConnell to say these strategies didn't work. They set us back.
Of course, it is Mitch McConnell who said that what I'm dedicated to is seeing that Obama is a one-term president.
Yes.
Well, that didn't work out too well, Mitch.
No, it didn't. It didn't. And again, I think a lot of that rhetoric can be useful. So you always have to take a look at and I don't mean useful for a productive society, but it can be politically useful. So you have to take a look at what someone like Mitch McConnell says, but then what do they do? Do they actually keep the lights on? Do they keep governing? And I think he is somebody who, unlike aspects of the Tea Party movement, want to keep the lights on, if only because it's better politics.
Well, I would like to take Grover Norquist's approach to the Tea Party and put it in the bathtub and drown it.
Sure.
But because I think that when it comes to moving this country forward and getting things done and addressing issues that are really of prime importance, they have done nothing except to really clog up.
Yeah, they've been a force that has prevented forward movement when it comes to public policy. I think there's no doubt about it, and I think a number of Tea Party members have said, "Judge me not by the bills I pass, but the bills that we don't pass or we don't allow to pass." And it is nice to see that taking a step back. Now the question is, again, has the Republican Party adopted so many of these policy areas, that is, no discussion of increasing revenue, and so forth. And I don't know the answer to that. Right now they're using that language, but so in that sense I think the Tea Party is resilient in that it's found a home within the Republican Party.
Well, it'll be interesting to see. Now let's take a look at Minnesota. In fact, Senator Carlson was just here as a guest, and we were talking. I look upon this past session of the Minnesota legislature as one of the most productive that they have had in decades. And they have a Democratic governor in both houses, but they really seem to have gotten some things done. They have erased the deficit, part of which is responsible for the economy getting better, part of which is really good stewarding on the part of the Democrats. What do you see in the next election here? And we have the whole House up this year, not the Senate, and the governor and all the constitutional offices are up. What do you see in the
Yes, I mean, looking over the legislative session, first of all, you see what one-party rule looks like, which is that one party can get its policy preferences through both the legislature and through the governor's office, which is what we saw happen. The DFL essentially said what they were going to do, and then they did what they said they were going to do. There are things that they're responsible for, and they may enjoy the political benefits of things that they're partially responsible for, like an economic recovery. It's easier to do these sort of things with a budget surplus. But it is interesting to see, and I think there's a really good comparison to be made between Wisconsin and Minnesota. That is to say, very similar demographics of the two states, very similar in terms of the wealth of the two states, and yet one has single-party rule Republican, one has single-party rule Democrat. They both voted for Obama in roughly the same amount. So very, very similar states, and we've seen different paths in each state, and it does seem that Minnesota's its economic health has led the nation, and Wisconsin's has not. So there is a pretty nice point of comparison with our neighbor state there. And Governor Walker essentially said, if we take on these things like collective bargaining, unions, and so forth, that there would be a lot of job creation, and they haven't seen that happen, and certainly not to the same degree that job creation has occurred in this state.
He promised 250,000 new jobs.
Yeah.
I think he has not made 25% of that promise.
Yeah, so you're seeing much different outcomes. Unemployment rate is much lower here. The tax increases that went through in the last legislative cycle weren't this doom and gloom scenario. With all that said, it is hard for those in the DFL to run in off-presidential years. That is, turnout here is not as good. Certain key constituencies of the Democrats don't show up, single women in particular, but women in general. So there are some issues. And generally the House has a tendency to fluctuate back to Republican control during midterm elections. So
what you're saying, it's a get out your vote year.
It's a get out your vote year, which it always should be, but it's going to be hard. And then of course the margin in the House is not that great. So I think the margin is 11 in the Senate, but the Minnesota Senate is half the size, of course, as the Minnesota House. Minnesota House, I think the margin is 12, which isn't that great. So I would probably look to see an outcome, even though the DFL accomplished what they set out to do, and a lot of the economic indicators are looking good, especially in comparison to other states. that you're still at the very least going to see a tightening in terms of party control of the House, and if history's any guide, then perhaps a Republican control of the House.
What do you see on a national scale?
Well, that's the trouble here, is because the national politics are going to be dragging down what should be good news for the DFL here locally, which is they got through what they wanted to. Again, the economic indicators, unemployment, all that stuff is looking like it's on the up and up. More investment in higher ed, more investment in K through 12, all that kind of stuff is looking good. But the political headwinds nationally are going to be leaning against Democrats toward Republicans. You've got a president who's will be approaching his last 2 years in office, but we get tired of all of our presidents at this time.
Whose standings have gone down.
They've gone down, and you can look at presidential approval over time, and you see a constant trajectory downward. That people get sick of their president after a while, and they begin to be a drag on the party. I don't know how much legs the Affordable Care Act or MNsure is going to have here at the state and local level. I have a feeling that that's probably overblown at this stage, and that's going to be in the past by the time we get to the election. But I think the state and local politics should favor the Democrats, but I think national politics and just the reality of midterm elections are obviously going to be a headwind that the DFL is going to face.
And of course, 1/3 of the senators, United States senators, are running also.
Yeah.
And the Democrats only have a 5-vote margin there, so that it could be a very interesting.
It could be very interesting. Yeah, there's a fair chance that the Senate could switch control. Now the Senate, as we know, they have a lot more individual autonomy. So even if it did go toward the Republicans or was narrowly controlled by the Democrats, it's going to be very difficult to get a lot through the Senate, even with some of the changes in the filibuster rules. So I think no matter what, you're going to see a less functional Senate as we go in relative to what we see now.
And then, of course, we have a really interesting 2016 down the road. We don't know, but certainly the Republicans are acting as though Hillary is already the candidate. And Andy Borowitz in the New Yorker had an interesting column the other day. Says, Benghazi, Republicans prove that it was the fault of a brain-damaged old woman.
Right, right, yeah.
They really have gone after her.
Yeah, well,
unfairly.
Certainly that's what everybody thought,
Yeah.
At this stage, going into the 2008 election, that it was a done deal, that Hillary Clinton would get the nomination and so forth, and it just kind of goes to show that we don't exactly know what's going to happen. Same thing on the Republican side, everyone thought Chris Christie was going to be a shoe-in and going to dance to that nomination. That certainly hasn't been the case. It's not to say that he's eliminated, but
That's because he couldn't get to Washington because the bridge was closed.
That's right. So all these things, it is interesting how the talking heads sort of proclaim something as preordained when the reality is that there's still a very good chance that Hillary Clinton won't be the Democratic nominee. It's still wide open on the other side, and we don't exactly know yet.
I said 2 years ago that I envisioned Jeb Bush being the Republican candidate, and all these other people that are surfacing just making a lot of noise, but that once again we will have to beat around the bush.
Well, he's a strong politician, and certainly could make inroads to the Hispanic community, but I think both the Bush and Clinton name, there's a good degree of fatigue associated with both of those names, and there's an opening for a new face, and I wonder what side that may occur on, or maybe both.
That's what I think Elizabeth Warren thinks also, who's a possibility.
That's right.
Amy Klobuchar, who's mentioned on a national ticket,
Sure.
not necessarily heading it, but
Yeah.
possibly as vice presidential timber.
Yeah, absolutely. And as a great retail politician, as somebody who really connects well to others, I think depending on who ultimately gets the nominee, she could really complement a lot of people well.
And she's a great public speaker, and she has a great sense of humor.
Yeah. Well, that's going to be the challenge, too, in the state when it comes to the gubernatorial race this time, which is that Mark Dayton should have a lot of things going for him. At the same time, you could certainly imagine a gifted politician rising on the Republican side who connects well runs a good campaign could certainly challenge Mark Dayton effectively in a midterm cycle.
How about Al Franken? I don't know of any senator in his first term who has accomplished as much as Al Franken has accomplished, and yet gotten as little publicity out of it, and certainly has had attackers right along.
Some of that might be by design, is that he really hasn't been running to the cameras every chance he gets. Part of that might be credibility with fellow senators, I would imagine, that he didn't seem to want to parlay his fame into media events. And so he has kind of kept his head down, learned the institution, focused on serious issues, but not issues that were always that sexy. And in a sense, it was sort of a page, and I know this is often said, from how Hillary Clinton approached her time in the Senate, which is to earn the respect of your colleagues, keep your head down, even though you're coming into the role as kind of a famous person. That'd be my guess. But no, I certainly see that too, that maybe some of the fact that he's kept his head down has not allowed him to get some of the credit that he deserves.
Although he's running some interesting ads now.
Yeah. And that'll be another challenging race, although I suspect by the way that he has conducted himself in office, it's not going to be as challenging as the first one.
Now, you study the political system. What do you think new media has had as an effect on the political system? We're down to 140 characters.
Yeah.
On sound bites. The whole world has changed so much. The days of FDR and his fireside chats are over. Nobody seems to have the patience to listen to anything more than 10 or 30 seconds at the most. How do you think that new media is going to affect elections?
Well, there's a lot of issues there. I mean, yeah, there's the attention span component of it, although people are seeking out information that they care about, and they're getting much more involved in a more narrow scope of information. So if someone really cares about an issue, they might seek out a specific source and read a lot about it. Problem is that we like to look at media that reinforces our existing views, right? So folks will seek out the stuff that tells them essentially how right they already are. So that's problematic. When it comes to campaigning, I think the other issue with regard to new media is the capacity to really target voters and use some of the demographic data out there to tell a very specific message to a very narrow part of the electorate. And that's kind of dangerous, because you could have the same candidate telling two different groups of people, in many cases, conflicting messages in a very narrow way.
That's what Mitt Romney told me.
Yeah, and that's dangerous. It potentially erodes the system that we're in, and so people take a look at demographic data.
In a world today where everything you do is recorded,
sure,
and can be played back,
Absolutely.
Some of these people still don't seem to have the clue that whatever they say
sure.
is a matter of record. If you don't believe me, ask Don Sterling of the
well, and that's
Clippers.
why that's why it gets so important too. Some of these, from a political standpoint, using some of these third-party groups to make some of these statements. Obviously, you don't want it directly coming from a figure, but it is a real problem. These focused political messages that are targeting different groups based on what people buy, what magazines they subscribe to, all those kind of things, and that's
and
something
of course we
that
have no
erodes our
privacy anymore, so everybody knows everything about us.
Yeah, I mean, it's again, you go to Target and you buy certain products, that evidence that shopping pattern is being tracked, right?
Or they're even lifting it right off
our
our computers in many instances.
So those are things that marketers across the board, but also political strategists, are taking a look at, and you're going to see a lot of different messages, more narrowly targeted than ever, I think, in the next election cycle.
I think that's one of the things that elected Obama, is that he ran a campaign that took more advantage of new media than the Republicans did. And I think everybody is now savvy to that.
Sure, I think that's right. And I think, that was the difference too between the Obama-Clinton campaign. Is Hillary Clinton ran a much more traditional campaign, not as many grassroots operatives, those kind of things. And I think everybody has learned that lesson, that's the way to run campaigns at this point.
And I don't know if she's ready to get on a skateboard at 69, but that might be...
Right. That's always the challenge. But, you saw it, even like in how she organized here in Minnesota, she might have had 6, 8 Minnesota operatives where Obama had, dozens of people who were organizing at a community level, and it was effective.
Well, I just got a T-shirt that I didn't wear today that says Bernie Sanders for president.
Right.
Because now here's a man who's an independent.
Mm-hmm.
He might be more aligned with the progressive point of view, but there's a man who really has a conscience, that really cares about the country, that really cares about the people, that really cares about health care, that really, as I say, has a conscience. He really cares about the people. He's pro-union because he knows that unions are really what built the middle class in this country. And as we are diminishing unions, we are diminishing the middle class. I don't know why people don't see that. I don't know why that message doesn't get through.
I think the evidence is there. You can see the rise and decline of unions, and you can put that graph side by side with the rise and decline of the American middle class, and they line up perfectly. And I certainly experienced it myself as a young person. My dad was a truck driver and a Teamster, and had opportunities coming out of high school to have a middle-class lifestyle that people don't have today because of the collective bargaining and those
and we're getting driven further and further apart, where the money at the top, that top 2% or whatever you want to call it, really eclipses what so large a percentage
that's what you see.
makes on the other end.
Absolutely. I mean, you've seen very little increase in terms of working class wages and so forth, and yet this country has become phenomenally more wealthy than it was a generation or two ago, which means that all those resources obviously are not just going to the top 1%, but it's even more interesting to see how much is in the hands of a fraction of that top 1%. That tenth of that 1%.
If you had it to do over again, would you become a hedge fund manager?
Well, yeah, that's the issue, and that's an area too where across the political spectrum, nobody is really talking about some of the policy changes that were made in the 40s and 50s to have a much more dramatically more progressive tax base, and those were decisions that we made obviously after World War II. And in the build-up to World War II, as almost like this national sacrifice, but there isn't that
no, there isn't absolutely
energy
not
anymore. Absolutely.
It's become a me philosophy, and that's pretty scary, the me philosophy.
Yeah.
And so how is this affecting higher education?
Well, higher education, I mean, particularly in the state of Minnesota, we've seen, really up until recently, about a decade of disinvestment in the state. A lot of students would take a look and talk about their rising tuition, but if you take a look at MNsure, where I work, the per pupil expenditure is about the same today as it was a decade ago. In fact, it might even be slightly less because class sizes are a little larger, and a lot of cost-saving measures have been taken. So students, of course, rightly ask, why is my tuition up? And the issue is that the state used to fund about 2/3 of the cost of going to a state institution, a MNsure institution, in 2000, and now that's inverted. So the state covers about 1/3 as opposed to 2/3. So there's been that disinvestment. Now we have seen some progress recently. In the supplemental budget that just went through, we saw additional appropriation for MNsure. We saw a supplemental addition to MNsure's base funding of $17 million. So we're starting to see that turn a little bit, but there's a lot of recovery that needs to happen after a decade of disinvestment.
How can the countries of Europe and the other industrialized countries manage to have universal health care and pay all higher education costs for their students? And we see the statistics. We are falling behind in both areas. How can they manage it, and yet we can't? Is it the divide between the political parties? What is it? Is it greed?
I think there's components of that. I mean, the United States, first of all, does have the most elaborate, most expansive college and university system in the world, and that's great. That's wonderful that we have that. However, the funding mechanisms aren't in place to fully support that. So if you do compare the United States even to peer countries in Europe, we do have a wonderful college and university system. The problem is the costs of that have been pushed away from the public. The public is starting to see it less as a collective good, right? And more as an individual good for someone to pay for themselves, right?
Is there a college whose president really is entitled to a $6 million plus salary, Ohio State?
Right.
Is there a coach, a football coach, who really is entitled to $3 or $4 million and a golden parachute if he's fired?
No, across the board, you're seeing more
when the
administrative
adjuncts
bloat,
and the professors and the people who are doing the teaching have not seen that rise.
And Minnesota, in a sense, too, we've got a better thing going for part-time faculty than a lot of other states do. That is that, at least in the two-year system in MNsure, they're on the same contract. If a part-time professor is on the same contract, they get a prorated salary based on what they would be if they were full-time tenured faculty. That is a wonderful thing that has been negotiated by the union that represents Minnesota two-year faculty. Most other states don't have that, so they pay their adjuncts a pittance. In many cases, they are at the poverty level, they don't have health insurance and so forth. So Minnesota is sort of ahead of the curve with respect to that. But it's absolutely true that if you reward senior administrators for cutting costs, the easiest way to do it, if at all possible, is to bring in more adjuncts that aren't benefited and to scale back tenured faculty.
And that does affect, I believe, it affects the quality of education.
I mean, I can
no matter
speak
how
to,
dedicated those people are.
as a faculty member myself, when you're teaching at 3 institutions out of the trunk of your car, that's a lot different than having an office where a student can stop by and talk about what they want to do. So there is a cost associated with that, moving toward part-time, non-benefited faculty.
And we're down to a minute and a half, so it goes very rapidly. And we're talking with Professor Dr. Zack Sullivan. I don't think he was a doctor when we first had you on the show, but congratulations in that regard.
Yeah. Good to have that wrapped up.
And always really interesting to look not only at the educational structure of the country, but the political structure. And I know you're on top of both of those, so it's always fun to have you in and a learning experience to have you in.
Well, I really appreciate it. I always enjoy coming and having a chance to talk to you.
Do you have any last thoughts you want to impart to the audience?
No, I think what you saw in the last legislative session is that those groups that mobilized and got organized with this in the legislative session were able to get a lot done for the groups they represented. So it was a good sign for representative government.
Senator Carlson just advised me, and I thought we didn't pass a puppy mill bill. But we did pass a puppy mill bill for the first time after trying for about 20 years. And that's such a good thing. We were one of 4 states that didn't have any supervision of these terrible puppy mills, and made me particularly happy, who has lived with rescue dogs. And anyway, Zack Sullivan, thanks so much. Come back soon.
Thank you. Appreciate it.